Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Mcguire. I'm the Program Officer for the World Affairs Council of Albuquerque. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. We have in our audience our members of the World Affairs Council here in Albuquerque, as well as friends of the World Affairs Council and folks from around the world who have seen the information about this webinar on the World Affairs Council of America's site, as well as from the NATO information that's been put out. I would like to thank Damian Arnaud and Radka Lakova of NATO, Bill Clifford and Laura Duncan of the WAC National Office for their help and guidance in putting this together. It has been invaluable. I'd like to thank Bob Goff, who has agreed to moderate the Q&A session this morning. Well, it's morning in New Mexico and whatever it is where you are. Bob is a past president of our council and has had extensive experience in arms control, so he should be able to do a wonderful job for us, as he has done in the past. I would like to say that we have two programs in our queue. On May the 27th, we'll have Ambassador Mike Hammer speaking to us on the Biden administration's policy towards Africa. And then on June 15th, we'll have Jack Devine and Jonathan Ward speak to us on the issue of Russia and China and their relationships. For today's session, as questions occur to you, I would ask that you use the chat feature in the Zoom. In the bottom middle of your screen, you'll see a button for chat. If you click on that, you can then submit your questions. You'll want to submit the questions to everyone, and that way Bob Goff can see them as they come up, and when we get into Q&A, can relay those to our speakers, because they unfortunately don't have a Zoom screen in front of them. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speakers. Jessica Cox is the director of the Nuclear Policy Directorate, and Lieutenant General Scott Kinsvader is the Deputy Chairman of the Military Committee at NATO, and they are joining us today from Brussels. So with that introduction, although albeit brief, I didn't want to take up too much time. I will now turn the floor over to our speakers, Ms. Cox and General Kinsvader.
Great. Well, I will thank you for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. It is, in fact, dinner time here at NATO headquarters, so we're in a very different time zone here. I just need to start off with one quick caveat. Although I am still affiliated with the U.S. government, I'm speaking here today in my NATO capacity. So my remarks and my views do not reflect U.S. government policies or decision making. So I'm here in my NATO capacity. And I'm going to talk today about our policies for nuclear deterrence and how we think about nuclear deterrence here at NATO. Nuclear weapons have been a core component of NATO's overall capabilities for deterrence and defense since its inception over 75 years ago. And although the end of the Cold War brought dramatic changes to NATO's nuclear posture, with the reduction of the number of nuclear weapons stationed in Europe by around 90%, NATO allies have continued to view nuclear deterrence as the ultimate guarantee of NATO's security. This is highlighted by NATO leadership, who continue to affirm that NATO will remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist, noting that the fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear capability is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. NATO's nuclear deterrence capabilities include dual-capable aircraft and U.S. nuclear weapons forward deployed in Europe, along with the strategic nuclear forces of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The dual-capable aircraft, what we call DCA aircraft, are central to NATO's nuclear deterrence mission in Europe, involving both nuclear and non-nuclear allies in the nuclear mission and decision-making of the alliance. This provides an important signaling tool to potential adversaries and enhances the credibility of our deterrence capabilities and signals political unity and resolve. It is vitally important that we continue to keep these capabilities safe, secure, and effective in order to provide a credible deterrent against potential adversaries. NATO allies who participate in the DCA mission are investing in new aircraft, and the U.S. is modernizing the B-61 nuclear weapons that are deployed in Europe. Some of that work is happening even in the labs in Albuquerque. Similarly, allies support U.S., UK, and French efforts to modernize their nuclear arsenals and maintain effective capabilities. Unfortunately, nuclear deterrence has become more critical for transatlantic security over the past decade. We now face the most difficult security environment in a generation, including nuclear proliferation and nuclear threats. Once again, we see Russia building up its nuclear forces and diversifying its nuclear delivery systems and platforms. Particularly troubling for NATO, Russia is expanding its theater-range missile forces, including its Caliber sea-launched cruise missiles, the Iskander short-range ballistic missiles, and the SSC-8 ground-launched cruise missile, which was the missile system that was in violation of the INF Treaty. These missiles are all dual capable, which means they can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads, leading to greater uncertainty and potential for miscalculation and escalation in a crisis. And as can be seen in unclassified press reporting, experts suggest that Russia possesses significantly more non-strategic nuclear warheads than NATO allies have either deployed or developed. Russia's short and intermediate range missiles are designed to threaten Allied critical infrastructure, hold significant NATO military targets at risk from both conventional and nuclear strikes, and undermine our cohesion. And these capabilities can target anywhere in the European continent. In addition, in 2018, Russian President Putin announced a number of so-called novel nuclear weapons systems. Russia is making progress on all of these novel weapons. These include hypersonic missile systems, which create new security challenges with their combination of high speed, maneuverability, and unusual altitudes, allowing them to evade missile defenses and avoid detection during flight. Russia has tested and deployed its intercontinental range Avangard hypersonic missile vehicle and is rapidly developing its Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missile and its Zircon sea-launched hypersonic cruise missile systems. Russia's continued investment in this diverse number of dual-use nuclear missile systems raises serious concerns about its regional intentions and creates added risk of escalation or misperception. Russia's renewed and increasing reliance on nuclear weapons, in addition to expanding nuclear arsenals in countries like China and North Korea, mean that NATO's status as a nuclear alliance remains relevant and important to addressing the security needs of allies today. This does not mean that NATO will engage in a nuclear arms race or deploy new ground-launched nuclear systems of our own, but we are taking steps to ensure that our current capabilities remain credible and effective in light of these growing threats. These include steps to increase the survivability and resilience of our nuclear forces and related capabilities, as well as seeking ways to reduce the risks of misunderstanding or mistake. But in an increasingly complex security environment, NATO's nuclear capabilities remain critical to deterring Russia and any other potential nuclear adversary. They are also an important signal of political unity, not only towards our adversaries, but also to reassure allies that we remain committed to their security, together as an alliance. So let me stop there, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jessica. I'll just highlight just a couple things. We recently completed the NATO Chiefs of Defense Conference yesterday with all of the 30 chiefs here. The broad strategic context of that discussion was the current strategic environment and NATO's adaptation in the future. We are at an inflection point right now. I would call it NATO 3.0. NATO 1.0 was the old Cold War days. We had the Soviet Union. We had one strategic foe. We had a Paul Mill strategy focused strictly on that foe. And when the Berlin Wall fell down in 1989, we transitioned to a time where I would call it NATO 2.0, and 9/11 was part of that, where we focused on strictly out-of-area operations. There was no particular need to defend Europe based on the strategic foe was gone. And we focused on, of course, Afghanistan, Iraq, all out-of-area contingencies. Kind of an away game, if you want, and that was NATO 2.0. Well, since 2008 and really 2014, NATO has been in a big adaptation phase and transitioning to what I called NATO 3.0. And that 3.0 is we have to do still out-of-area operations, defend abroad, defend against terrorism, but also start the refocus, as Jessica mentioned, on deterring the near peer and the global competition that we're in phase right now. So back to the collective defense mode. So for the West, nuclear deterrence has worked well for the past 75 years. No nuclear weapon state is engaged in open conflict with another. The strategic environment of today is perhaps the most difficult in a generation or two. But I'd contend that strategic deterrence, as Jessica mentioned, is still foundation of our freedom of movement of the West and our freedom of action in the West. I have faith in the strength of our nuclear deterrent. I have faith in the rationality of our decision-making processes in the West. And it's vital moving forward that, as Jessica mentioned, that we consistently evaluate our effectiveness, we evaluate our safety, our surety, our security, and our readiness of our forces and our arsenal to ensure that deterrent capability is set really for those future generations to maintain the same safety umbrella that we have for the last 75 years. With that, Jessica and I are both happy to take any questions you may have.
Well, let me thank you both for being here, joining us in this conversation. I know it's late in the day in Brussels, so we're doubly appreciative of your taking time to do that. I'd remind all of our participants that if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. I see already there are quite a few, probably more than we have time to address today. So if you'll permit me, I'll try to do a little bit of selecting those questions that seem closest to our topic. And one of which I guess I would ask right now, and that comes to us from Thomas Schmidt, and he says, basically, what happens if NATO's nuclear deterrent fails? What are the options then?
So I guess I'll start. Obviously, this is the worst case scenario if our deterrence fails. And so we would be faced with a situation that we've never had to encounter before if we're faced with an adversary that has used nuclear weapons against us in conflict. And that would fundamentally change the nature of a conflict and the nature of our response options. But what we would do, I mean, obviously we would be fighting a war against the potential adversary. We would have a lot of conventional forces, I would be assured, that would be working to fight the fight. And from a nuclear perspective, we would start to look at our options for restoring deterrence and ensuring that we could prosecute and win at the lowest level of conflict possible. So we would be looking at options for response across the spectrum, dependent on the scenario and what we felt our options would be. We would be getting military advice, of course, but ultimately the decisions would be made by the political leadership at NATO to address how we could restore deterrence and ensure it did not fail again.
Yeah, I'd add that's a tough question. Obviously, right out of the chute, the strategic deterrence failure. I completely agree with Jessica. That is something that is almost like a pandemic, unrecognizable. Right? Nobody on the planet had lived through the pandemic before 100 years ago, and we're all working our way through this. So, strategic deterrence failure. Nobody on the planet has been through that. So. Yeah, we have to then immediately drive back to something that's recognizable, because that would not be recognizable to any of us. And you do that through proper escalation control and escalation dynamics to put pressure on whatever adversary did that to us in so many pressure points. And you're talking non-kinetic, you're talking monetary, you're talking economic, you're talking information, and strong military power. Put so much pressure on them that it drives them back into something recognizable. I think of 21st century deterrence as really simple. You maintain a great red and blue picture of yourself and your adversary. You're able to then deny that to your adversary. You make decisions at speed, very fast, so you outpace your adversary. And then you give them so many problems, not in domain, but in so many different domains, that your adversary then really cripples their ability to react. So if we're doing our job in the West, we have that picture and we're able to avoid that escalation to where we got to that place in the future, in your question, that they realize that they can't go there with us, because we would drive them to something that would be unrecognizable as well.
Well, if deterrence fails, as you put it, as Jessica put it, it really is the worst case scenario. It does involve conflict at whatever level it can be controlled at. And so then Stephen Shore asks, NATO has 3 nuclear powers as members. How integrated are their nuclear capabilities and roles? And of course, he's talking about the US and the UK and France. So are their nuclear capabilities and roles really integrated through NATO, and to what extent?
Absolutely. Obviously the 3 nuclear powers play very important roles in their own right, providing for the deterrence of the alliance, but they all have very unique roles as well. So, for instance, the UK has its continuous at-sea deterrence, its submarine forces, and it completely extends its deterrence to NATO. So its full nuclear force would be used for the deterrence and defense of NATO if called upon to do so. The U.S., of course, has both its strategic forces, but that it extends to NATO allies, but it also has the specific U.S. weapons that are deployed that it deploys in the European theater. That would be part of a NATO dual-capable aircraft response, and is part of that force package. And then you have France, which has independent nuclear capabilities, so they don't extend their specific deterrence to allies. But of course, as a member of NATO and as a nuclear member of NATO, their independent nuclear capabilities also play a very important role in having separate centers of decision-making and complicating the thinking of a potential adversary. From a political standpoint, the US and UK are very much integrated into the overall political decision-making of the alliance. So we have the Nuclear Planning Group, which is the decision-making body here that covers all of NATO's nuclear deterrence decision-making, from everything from, at the very worst case, nuclear employment options, but all of our policies, exercises and things like that, the Nuclear Planning Group is responsible for. France has chosen not to participate in the Nuclear Planning Group because of the independence of their own strategic forces. But obviously they play an important role here at NATO in the other structures in place for defense and deterrence. They're a very strong advocate of nuclear deterrence, both publicly and within the alliance, making sure that we have strong deterrence policies and broader strategic thinking. So all of our work at NATO is done by consensus. So it's not just the nuclear allies that are driving policies; it's all allies. But they're all integrated, and they all have very important but different roles to play in our political processes and decision making.
General, did you have anything to add to that?
No, it was very well done by Jessica. The only thing from a military perspective I would add is that the capabilities complement each other very well. And it was a great question by Stephen, and that very strategically predictable.
And of course, Sakir is also the commander of EUCOM, so you have a direct link in our military chain of command with the dual-hatted nature of the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and the commander of U.S. EUCOM.
The U.S. is now considering a ground-based strategic deterrent, essentially a new missile, excuse me, to replace Minuteman III. Does NATO take any view on that program? Excuse me again. Or more generally, on the U.S.'s view of the triad as having all three separate legs as being the foundation of nuclear deterrence.
So I would say from a NATO allies perspective, the U.S. decisions about its own force posture are, of course, a national responsibility of the United States. So I don't think we have a specific view of the Minuteman replacement. But I would say that the overall posture of the United States, ensuring that they have modern, credible, and effective nuclear deterrence, is of vital importance to the allies, right? So we very much support U.S. modernization overall. We support UK and French modernization of their forces as well. It's important that our capabilities are state-of-the-art and cutting edge, and that we have capabilities that are credible. Certainly, the Russians are gaining the extremely credible and high-end forces, and so we need to make sure that the overall pool of forces that we have across the alliance, are those that are effective and credible against future threats. But the specific programmatics of the U.S. modernization and what the triad is composed of, and those choices obviously are up to the United States to make those choices based on a range of national factors that allies discuss with the United States, but of course are not the driving force there.
Thank you. Another question pertaining to deterrence comes from Emil Nakle, who is the president of the Albuquerque Council of the World Affairs Council. And Emil poses a two-part question. One is, what role do you expect artificial intelligence and other critical technologies to play in the concept of nuclear deterrence? And then secondly, do you view Iran's nuclear deal as an integral part of nuclear deterrence? Now, there are two quite distinct, I think, questions about deterrence, but if either of you would like to address either of Emil's questions.
On the AI one, I guess I could just add militarily, and I wouldn't put a nuclear piece on it. That would be way into the policy lane. But from what I have seen with my own perspective in AI and using AI, it has great military application in logistics. It has great military application in medical. It has great military applications in unmanned systems and systems that are able to help you with intelligence as well, right? So intelligence gathering type apparatuses, it's great to use almost as something that's digesting tons and tons and tons of data. So those are three big applications right there. And from a nuclear perspective, I wouldn't even want to talk about what policy implications we have there. NATO, it wouldn't be in a NATO lane necessarily, and not necessarily in a military lane. On Iran, the only thing I would address there is the threat of their ballistic missile systems, and how NATO is a player in protecting the continent and protecting our resources against those ballistic missiles.
I would just add on the AI front, I completely agree. I would just commend, I co-authored an article on the potential benefits of AI for nuclear deterrence and nuclear arms control with Heather Williams, and it was in the spring edition of the Washington Quarterly. So you can go download that and check it out. But I think as we look at, AI is coming, it's going to come through a range of ways. Specifically things like logistics, intelligence, as the general mentioned, will be applications of AI that will have potentially tremendous benefits, including for the nuclear deterrence mission, where being able to correctly diagnose the situation is going to be of really critical importance. So I think we need to kind of start thinking about the potential benefits, and then there's of course things that we would not want AI to do. Right? We would not want AI to do nuclear targeting or employ our nuclear weapons. Those are decisions for people and for policymakers, and it would have very tremendously negative repercussions if we start looking at artificial intelligence for those types of applications in the nuclear domain. So it's not a one or the other. I think it's AI as a technology is going to mature, and the nuclear deterrence mission, like other areas of technology, is going to look at adapting as well. And I don't really have much to add on Iran, so I think that was.
Okay. Turning to the arms control aspect of this for just a moment. First of all, what does NATO see the current state of the Chemical Weapon Convention, in particular the violations in Syria, the Russian violations of the INF, which you touched on a bit earlier, Jessica, and the outer space treaties, and then as Hiroaki Nakanishi asks us, how can NATO incentivize China for establishing a post-INF treaty framework, which includes China?
Yeah.
So it's a little beyond the NATO charter of the transatlantic nature of NATO, but certainly China is part of the threat environment that NATO has to deal with. And is there a way to bring China into the nuclear arms control treaty regimes?
Policy questions there. I'll let Jessica talk about the INF and a little bit on China. I think from my perspective on China, I would wait. In just 3 weeks, we're going to have the head of state and government meeting here at NATO headquarters. And from that, I think you'll see some China policy deliberations and maybe some decisions on where the alliance goes with China. So I would leave that one there. And Jessica, if she wants to talk about the arms control piece of it, which is really a U.S. We're both in our NATO hats here, as you know. The Chemical Weapons Convention, having spent time in the counter-ISIS fight, running operations and intelligence, I would just say those violations are obviously treated really seriously. And I think you saw a few years ago, I can't remember specifically, where you had like-minded nations that were allies as well, U.S., U.K., France, conduct a strike as a method of deterrence and a method of punishment and a method to uphold that convention, and also to uphold kind of the Western way of doing business in conflict. And you see that a lot with the alliance. It's a wonderful way to bring like-minded nations together to do things that may not be necessarily under a NATO umbrella, but are under like-minded global Western MO of doing business. And I think you saw that with the chemical weapons convention strikes in Syria. Jessica, over to you on INF stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, on INF, of course, it ended in 2019. So allies were very supportive of the U.S. decision to withdraw. I think that there was recognition across the alliance that Russia was in violation of the treaty, and that over a number of years, the United States and allies had called on Russia to return to compliance. We had raised this from a NATO perspective in the NATO-Russia Council, and then many nations, if not all, had raised it bilaterally with Russia as well. And they refused to return to compliance with the treaty. And so when the U.S. made the decision to withdraw, allies were supportive of that decision. We were hopeful that Russia would see it as an opportunity to further discussions, but they did not. And they did not take the opportunity. And, I think their posture is still not even acknowledging that their missile system is in fact an intermediate range missile. So I think, that is where it is. The treaty is over, and we're kind of moving on. From a response perspective, and the decisions we've taken since the end of the INF treaty to make sure we're able to respond to the Russian intermediate range missile threat include a broad spectrum of responses. So first and foremost, we've been looking at ways to enhance our theater range missile defense capabilities, so not our ballistic missile defenses, but our theater range systems. We've looked at enhancing our conventional strike capabilities, looking at enhanced ISR so that we're able to track and get greater intelligence on Russia's INF violating systems. Looking at, including these capabilities in our exercises, so we're prepared to defend against these types of missile capabilities. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we've taken a number of steps to make sure that our nuclear deterrent is resilient and survivable against these types of missile threats. But it's not just it's ground-launched intermediate-range missiles that we're worried about. As I mentioned before, Russia has a range of intermediate-range capabilities now that it can launch from air, land, and sea platforms that can attack, European NATO and reach parts of all NATO allies with little to no warning from all strategic directions, as we say here in NATO. So these are really troubling developments. And from a NATO perspective, we're not engaging in an arms race with Russia. We're not deploying our own, nuclear INF range systems. But we are making sure that we have the capabilities that we need to defend and deter Russia from attack. Oh, and on China arms control. As General Kinswater said, China is a topic that will be on the agenda for heads of state. I think a number of allies and the Secretary General have already spoken out about NATO's desire to see China engage in transparency on risk reduction and on arms control. From a NATO perspective, obviously, we're not, party to arms control treaties. Those are things that are entered into by nations. Certainly, the nuclear nations already have discussions with China through the P5 and other fora. But we certainly, from a NATO perspective, want to see China be more transparent about its nuclear capabilities, its doctrine and its policies, if for no other reason than to reduce risk. But from a more important standpoint, so we understand what the potential threat is that we face.
Speaking of arms control, I think everyone is aware of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which includes all of the members of NATO. But Stephen Shore asks, does NATO have a policy about the acquisition of nuclear weapons by any other NATO members? A policy that I assume Stephen means would go beyond their obligations under the NPT.
So I would just say that all allies are members of the NPT and feel are strongly committed to the NPT and the success of the NPT. I don't think we need any policies about other allies acquiring nuclear weapons because we have the nuclear sharing arrangements in place. We have extended deterrence from the US and UK. And allies are very much committed to their treaty obligations, and in particular the NPT.
My view is that the NPT is the multilateral arms control arrangement that is the foundation, really, for all of the others. So I think we all look to the 5-year review conferences and somehow to strengthen them. Sabina Gershon asks if Ukraine has NATO protection in the case of Russian aggression. What would you like to say about that?
Say that question again. If Ukraine has?
Yes. Does Ukraine have NATO protection in the event of a possible Russian aggression against Ukraine?
Yeah,
Ukraine's not a member of NATO,
absolutely. So the Secretary General has come out.
Have the I guess it's Article 5 protection, but does it have other protection?
I think all nations, all 30 nations, have come out recently that they, are the relative to the abhorrent Russian buildup on the border, and condemn that, and all, recognize Ukraine's sovereignty as a nation state. And there's a number of bilateral relationships that are going on right now with Ukraine across the alliance, and I think that is where you see the relationship with Ukraine right now at its best. It doesn't mean that NATO doesn't support. They very much support Ukraine's sovereignty, but how that is then executed to defend Ukraine is done through bilateral relationships, and that's all I could say there.
Well, it is a bit tangential to NATO, but nonetheless a question of interest. I'd also ask, what lessons has NATO learned from the recent Russian incursions in the Ukraine, or perhaps even in Afghanistan? What lesson learning process does NATO have, and what are the major lessons that NATO is learning there?
Yeah, from a military perspective, we see obviously Russia being a very subversive power and continuing to be a subversive power. They don't like the rules-based order we have currently. They have, and Jessica mentioned this, they have conventional dominance over their neighbors, and they have missile dominance over the continent of Europe because they want to hold Europe at risk, they want to hold the alliance at risk, and they want to push back against that rules-based order. And I think you're seeing the adaptation of the alliance since 2008, and specifically hard since 2014, pushing back against Russia's subversive power. Whether you see that in the cyber domain or the space domain or in conventional military domains. And the alliance has continued to adapt its defensive posture, both in the nuclear and conventional realm, and will continue to do so. And I think you'll see some positive indications of that come out also the head of state and government. I don't want to predefine what that would be like, but I think you'll see at least our leaders, our national leaders, talk about the continued subversive work that Russia does. And Ukraine is one more example of that recently.
To switch topics a bit here, there have been some frayed relationships between some NATO members in recent years, the US and Turkey, US or UK rather, Brexit. Can you talk a bit about the effects of those frayed relationships on NATO's work?
The only thing I would add, I've been in the alliance now for 4 years, 2 years at SHAPE, headquarters in Mons, and now 2 years here in Brussels. The alliance is like having 30 brothers and sisters at the dinner table with no mom and dad, right? The chaos from that, as you can imagine, would be unbelievable. And I have a great relationship with my brother, but we don't agree on everything. And I have a great relationship with my spouse, but we don't agree on everything. So at the end of the day, you have a relationship with those people, and we have a relationship with our allies where you come to the table and you talk about those issues, because nations aren't going to agree on everything. There's no way we would expect them to agree. So the genius of the alliance 70 plus years ago was to bring these nations together and have them sit at the table every single day. And Jessica and I sit in these meetings for hours and hours and hours on end. And we're lucky enough to watch that dynamic, both militarily and politically, back and forth, to work through our issues without conflict. So that question came out as a negative thing, but I think it's actually a very positive thing, because none of us probably have a great relationship, perfect relationship with our spouse or our brother and sister, and we understand that there's frictions and dynamics, and you just talk through them and respect each other. And I see that respect every single day. No matter if it's a big ally like the U.S., or a small ally like Albania, everybody's at a seat at the table, and it's pretty special, a pretty special alliance.
I think that's an interesting analogy, and it reminds me that if all we hear are comments that echo our own, we never really grow and generate, do we? So it's important, I think, as you say, General, that we hear differing opinions, respect them, and deal with them in an appropriate fashion.
2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So you need to listen twice as much as you speak.
Right, right. What recently we had the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline here in the U.S. As a example, very visible example of hacking. What is NATO doing to deal with hacking, or is it leaving that largely to the 30 member states?
A lot of that on the cyber adaptation world, is indeed a national responsibility. But the alliance is a great venue for nations to talk about best practices, who's doing things well, who needs help, or who needs response, or who needs more training and education. So I've seen, just in my 4 years here, amazing amount of cyber adaptation to what's going on with Russia's subversive China activities, you name it. Now, I don't know on the pipeline specifics in the U.S., other than watching the news and seeing what's happening. But no matter where that comes from, if they start to identify that's nation state or something else, the adaptation that's going on here in the alliance, with the alliance naming cyber as a domain, and just recently space as another domain for the alliance, you're seeing nations start to build all of their credibility and all of their capacity at the same time, so that each of the 30 nations benefits from the goodness that's going on across the alliance. And I think you'll continue to see us get better and better and better over time, because all the nations realize what a big threat that is, which the pipeline attack just highlighted that for the nation states.
Hiroaki Nakanishi asks another question. He refers us to the upcoming U.S.-Russia strategic stability talks. What's NATO's expectation of those talks, and does NATO have particular elements or concerns that they hope will be addressed in those talks?
Yeah, so I think in general, NATO is very supportive of more dialogue with Russia. We have our own policy towards Russia is a dual track approach where we have, strengthening our deterrence and defense on the one hand and engaging in dialogue on the other. And so the talks, the strategic stability talks between the U.S. and Russia are something that the allies very much welcome. And look forward to collaborating and hearing from the U.S. on how they go specifically. I think from an expectation standpoint, I don't think that there's any expectations that there's going to be any breakthroughs or anything like that with a first round of talks. But the importance of dialogue, to understanding our adversaries, to identifying security risks and security threats, is something that's very important to do, and so allies are very supportive. I doubt that there'll be specific arms control proposals or things like that put on the table at this stage. I think from the U.S. and the press have been very clear that they plan to raise a number of security issues that they have with Russia and vice versa. We will likely get a readout from our U.S. colleagues here at NATO in committee. We'll be very lashed up with them throughout the process. So, but I don't think we have any kind of near-term expectations on specific results or outcomes. But we are supportive and are glad that the U.S. And Russia are engaging in these talks. And then from a NATO standpoint, of course, we continue to look to the NATO-Russia Council as a forum for broader dialogue between NATO allies and Russia, where, again, we can talk about some of the issues that divide us, including Ukraine, military activities and exercises, posture, hybrid threats, things like that. And so, allies continue to seek NATO-Russia Council meetings and to have a forum to have political, strategic conversations with Russia. So dialogue is not an end, but it is a good.
Thank you. I'd remind all of our participants that we have just a few minutes left, and so if there are any last questions, please put them into the chat box, and I'll see how many we can address. Jessica, you've touched on arms control a bit in the past, but Jack Siegel asks, if I understand his question, does NATO as an entity have an arms control mission? And we typically think about arms control as being agreements between nations rather than international organizations. But do you want to speak to NATO's role and view of arms control?
Yeah. So similar to the cyber domain, NATO is a really useful forum for collaboration and consultation amongst allies on arms control related issues. So as you point out, we're not a participant in and of ourselves in any specific arms control arrangements, but certainly allies use NATO as a forum for collaboration, for developing common positions, for having discussions within the alliance on both conventional and nuclear arms control agreements, for identifying and sharing security risks and challenges, and for supporting individual nations in their negotiations, whether that's the U.S. Bilaterally with Russia, or more broadly, say like in the context of the Open Skies Treaty, which is obviously a hot topic of conversation right now in the arms control world. The other thing that we're very actively engaged on here in NATO is looking at ways that allies can bring our skills to bear in the arms control to support the development of arms control. So things like developing new methods and means for arms control verification. So bringing, our skills, doing inspections and sharing best practices, developing those types of skills within the alliance where we can provide a solid scientific and technical expertise from across the alliance to support the development of arms control. And of course, the other thing that we do here is define security interests as well, right? So the reason that we engage in arms control is to foster and strengthen our security. And so having a common and shared view amongst the allies about what are the important things to tackle with arms control, the things that contribute to the security of the alliance, is another area of collaboration and coordination so that when individual nations engage in arms control negotiations, we have a shared vision of what our security interests are and the types of agreements that we want to pursue that will enhance our security and contribute to the overall security of the alliance.
I'd add that collaboration and security risk and challenges is a big, big deal. As just witnessed yesterday at the CHODS conference, which gets back to that Ukraine question. The Ukrainian CHOD was here with us and shared his challenges and his security risks and his issues with all the other CHODs of the NATO alliance. And they had a dialogue on how to help him. So it's just a really big deal that brings the alliance together, and so those 30 nation states can sit down and work together on any series of issues.
Before we close, we all have noted behind both of you speakers the prominent NATO 2030 sign. Do you want to say anything about that particular initiative that NATO is undertaking right now?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, and I can hit a couple military pieces.
Yeah, so the NATO 2030 initiative really came out of a recognition from our heads of state at the London Leaders Meeting in 2019 that we needed to really think about how to posture NATO for the next decade, so NATO 2030. And there's a number of initiatives that have contributed to kind of a strategic reflection process over the last really 18 months now, including a report from some prominent former leaders across the alliance, the strategic reflection report that was completed late last year. There's been a number of engagements with youth, with governments, with different entities to really think through how we want to position NATO for the future. And when heads of state meet next month at the summit, they're going to talk about a lot of the potential things that we can do, strengthening our political cohesion and our political strength, looking at, bolstering democracy, addressing shared risks like climate change, continuing to evolve our deterrence and defense, and a number of these types of initiatives to look at really how we strengthen the alliance across the board and make it more effective for the future. And when we convene in June, the heads of state will also consider whether to approve the development of a new strategic concept. This is kind of the guiding principles for the alliance. The last strategic concept was agreed in 2010. So obviously, a lot of things have changed in the last 11 years. And so the Secretary General will ask heads of state if it's time to embark on the development of a new strategic concept that really codifies the role of NATO for the future. And from a military standpoint,
Yeah,
sir.
that's just a great answer. It's just really the continued adaptation of our alliance. You see, the 21st security challenges in the 21st century are multi-domain. They're 360 degrees, as we like to say here. They're trans-regional. We see every day global competition and global friction out there across what I would call the global West. So as Jessica said, it's really a wonderful opportunity to strengthen our alliance that we hold so near and dear, the most important alliance in the history of humankind, and to increase that strengthening to our partners as well, who are like-minded, and like-minded in the global commons and the global processes that we have that have served us well and preserved peace for my generation, and our grandparents, really, through our parents and our young grandparents' generation. So we're excited about it.
Great. Well, we're running out of time, so I'll put one last question on the floor, and you may or may not want to address it. But if one has been reading the foreign policy journals the last year or so, one sees articles written about the variability in the style of U.S. presidential actions and decision making. And so what would you say about how that has affected NATO's decision making? And the underlying question is America still leading? Can it still lead in that environment? And so I'll thank you both for your participation while leaving that question on the table, if either of you would like to add a thought or two to it.
So I will just I'll dive in and just say, through, as General Kinsvater mentioned earlier, NATO is comprised of 30 nations, each with their own security interests, each with their own political interests, and each with their own leadership, right? And so, leaders come and go, different security interests and challenges come and go. But the important thing is that we're all sitting at the table together talking. And I think, over the last 4 years, the U.S. has continued to play a leadership role here in the alliance. They're doing so now, and they're renewing their commitments and renewing their leadership role here in the alliance. But I think, there's always different personalities, there's different nations, there's different things. And the important thing is that, that we're all here together, working through those issues, having the hard conversations together. And I think we've seen the success of that model, even over the past, through many changes of U.S. and other allied leadership over the last few years.
Thank you. Again, thank you both General Kinsvater and Ms. Cox for what I think has been an excellent discussion, wide-ranging discussion. And so with my thanks to you, I'll turn it back to Bob Mcguire to remind us of the next meetings and to close us off for the day.
Thank you, Bob. First of all, let me thank you for agreeing to moderate today's session. It was brilliantly done. And to Jessica Cox and General Kinsvater, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. We also appreciate the support we received from the staff at NATO who helped set this up, as well as the staff at our National World Affairs Council office who helped us set this up. The meeting reminders are you'll be receiving today a notice, our membership will be receiving a notice about our next meeting on May 27th with Ambassador Mike Hammer, and then our meeting on June 15th with Jack Devine and Jonathan Ward. Thank everyone again for attending and participating. We thank you for your questions and look forward to hope to see you next Thursday. And that ends today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.